Jason had spent years on that porch, watching the world pass him by. Every evening was the same, the street going gold, then dark, the quiet settling in like something he'd gotten used to carrying. Then a woman named Emma moved in next door, and the whole shape of his evenings changed, without him doing a single thing about it. She was warm and easy in her own skin, kind of person who made you notice the way light moved, and he couldn't stop noticing her. And one evening she caught him looking, and instead of turning away, she said something that made him cross the gap between their porches for the first time. Jason was 52, and most days he couldn't tell you when that happened. One year he was 30, with a wife and a plan, and the next he was alone on a porch he'd built with his own hands, watching the street do what it always did. The house was his. He'd paid it off through years of contract work that wore out his knees. Before it wore out his will. He still took small jobs here and there, a fence for a neighbor, a cabinet for someone's kitchen, because the quiet of full retirement scared him more than a sore back. Did his wife, Linda, had left 9 years ago. There was no explosion, no other man, no slammed door. She just started spending more evenings in the bedroom with a book, and he started spending more on the porch with a beer. And one morning she sat across from him at the kitchen table and said she didn't think either of them was happy. He hadn't argued because she was right, and being right about something that sad is its own kind of exhaustion. They split the house, the truck, the dog. He kept the porch. You know the kind of quiet that comes after someone leaves and never comes back. It fills the rooms like water, slow and steady, until you stop noticing how deep it's gotten. Jason didn't fight it. He let the quiet settle, and after a while, it became the temperature of his life, something he lived inside without thinking about it the way you stop feeling the weather when you've been outside long enough. His routine was simple, and he liked it that way. Coffee at 6:30, on the porch watching the street wake up, then work until lunch if there was work, or putter around the house if there wasn't. A sandwich at noon, always the same, ham and mustard on white bread, eaten standing at the counter, because sitting down for lunch alone felt like making an event out of something that wasn't one. Afternoons in the garage, sharpening tools that didn't need sharpening, straightening nails that were already straight, because hands that aren't busy find other things to do, and Jason's hands had never been good at idle. Then came the evening, the part of the day that belonged to him completely. He'd sit on the porch, swing with a beer, and watch the light go gold, and then blue, and then black, and listen to the neighborhood fold itself in for the night. The swing had a creak he'd stopped hearing. Years ago, a low groan on the backswing that had become part of the sound of his evenings, the way a clock becomes part of the sound of a room. He knew every house on the block the way you know the back of your hand. The Millers at the end had a dog named Rusty who barked at exactly 7:15 when the mail carrier came through, and the Diaz family across the street had 3 kids who rode bikes in circles until their mother called them in for dinner. And the house next door, the one that had been empty for going on 5 months, with its weathered for sale sign leaning a little more every time the wind picked up. Jason barely noticed the sign anymore. Empty houses on a quiet street are like missing teeth in a mouth you've stopped smiling with. Something you know is there, but have stopped poking at. He'd watched 2 families come and go from that house in the years since Linda left, and neither one had changed the shape of his evenings. A moving truck would arrive, furniture would go in, furniture would come out, and the porch stayed his and his alone. He wasn't unhappy. That's the part that would surprise people if they knew how he lived. He wasn't bitter or broken or waiting for something to happen. He was just alone, in a way that had become so familiar it felt like part of him, like the calluses on his palms or the scar on his left thumb from a table saw that slipped 20 years ago. The solitude didn't hurt anymore. It just sat there, and he sat with it, and together they watched the street go dark. The moving truck arrived on a Saturday morning in early April, and Jason saw it before he heard it. He was on the porch with his coffee, the way he was every Saturday at 7, when the diesel rumble turned the corner and backed into the driveway next door. He watched the whole thing, the way he watched everything from that porch, present, but separate, a man who observes without inserting himself into the picture. 2 men in uniforms started carrying boxes, and then a blue sedan pulled in behind the truck, and the driver's door opened and Jason's coffee stopped halfway to his mouth. A woman stepped out, auburn hair pulled up in a loose knot, sunglasses pushed back on her head, laughing at something on her phone. She wasn't what he expected, though he couldn't have told you what he expected, because he hadn't expected anything. She carried herself like someone who was comfortable in her own skin. The kind of ease that comes from liking yourself rather than performing for anyone else. She was maybe 32, 33, though Jason didn't think of it in numbers at first. He thought of it as the distance between someone whose life was still gathering speed and someone whose had already slowed. She glanced over while carrying a box toward the door. She waved. It was a small wave, the kind you give a neighbor you haven't met yet. Open-handed and easy, more acknowledgement than greeting. Jason lifted his coffee mug back at her. A gesture so small it barely qualified as contact, but it landed in his chest heavier than it should have. A tiny stone dropped into water that had been still for a long time. He watched her disappear inside with the box, and then he went back to his coffee and told himself it meant nothing. Neighbors wave. That's what neighbors do. He repeated this to himself 3 times over the course of the morning, once while refilling his mug, once while carrying his tools out to the garage, and once while standing in the garage doorway pretending to look for something he didn't need. The women came and went, directing the movers, laughing with them, signing something on a clipboard, and each time she crossed the driveway, Jason happened to be looking in that direction, and each time he told himself it was coincidence. By afternoon, the truck was gone, and the blue sedan was parked in the driveway, and the front door was propped open with a box, letting the warm April air into a house that had been sealed up for months. Jason went inside and made himself a sandwich, and ate it at the counter, and didn't think about the woman next door for the rest of the day, except that he did. He thought about the way she'd laughed with the movers. Easy and genuine, like someone who didn't need a reason to be in a good mood. He thought about the wave, how it had been so casual, so unforced, like she'd been waving at him for years. And he thought about the auburn hair, how it had caught the morning light in a way that made the whole driveway look different. That evening, he sat on his porch with his beer, and at dusk the porch light next door came on for the first time. 2 porches, side by side, both lit, both glowing soft yellow into the same stretch of evening air. Jason sat and looked at that for a long time, the 2 lights burning side by side, and something about the parallel glow shifted the feeling of the street for him in a way he couldn't have named if someone had asked. It was like the difference between a room with 1 lamp and a room with 2, the same space, but no longer just yours. Over the following weeks, small moments stacked up the way they do when 2 people live close enough to share a property line. Emma watered her garden in the mornings, while Jason drank his coffee, and the first few times she just nodded across the fence, and then the nods became hellos, and the hellos became short conversations about the weather or the soil or the roses the previous owner had left behind that she was trying not to kill. One morning she mentioned a leaky kitchen faucet, and asked if he knew a good plumber. Jason offered to take a look, because that was what he did, and within 20 minutes he was standing in our kitchen, with a wrench and a roll of Teflon tape, feeling like a giant in a room that smelled like lavender, and clean towels and something sweet she'd been baking. The faucet took 5 minutes to fix. He stayed for 30, because she handed him a cup of coffee and started asking about his work, and the questions weren't polite filler. She actually wanted to know, and the wanting showed in the way she listened, leaning against the counter with both hands wrapped around her mug, her attention full and steady, and aimed right at him. She thanked him the next day with a jar of homemade salsa left on his porch railing. No label, no explanation, just a folded note tucked under the lid that said, "Thanks, neighbor," with a smiley face drawn beside it. Jason picked it up and turned it over in his hands and carried it inside and put the salsa in the fridge and the note in the drawer of the porch table, the one where he kept the old bottle opener and a rusted pocket knife and the spare key he'd never given to anyone. He didn't know why he kept the note. He just folded it carefully and put it there, and somehow it stayed. The conversations grew from 30 seconds to 2 minutes to 5, then to 10, then to stretches where Jason lost track of how long he'd been standing at the fence with his hands in his pockets and his coffee getting cold. She asked about his work, and he asked about hers, and he learned she did freelance graphic design from a desk she'd set up by the front window, which explained why she was always around. She was easy to talk to in a way that unsettled him, because talking to someone shouldn't feel this startling after years of mostly silence. And yet every time she said his name, every time she said Jason like it was a word she enjoyed the shape of, something in him lifted without permission. He noticed things he wished he didn't notice. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking about a design problem. The sound of her laugh carrying across the yard on a warm afternoon, open and unguarded. The way she moved through her garden like she was having a private conversation with every plant, crouching down, talking softly, her fingers gentle in the dirt. He noticed all of it, and he cataloged it somewhere he couldn't reach to throw it away, and the catalog grew every day. The part that worried him was the part he couldn't stop doing. He'd moved his coffee from 6 to 6:45, because that was when she was usually out watering. He'd started taking his lunch on the porch instead of at the counter, because the porch was where he could hear her screen door open and close. He was adjusting his life around her the way you adjust a radio dial, small turns, barely noticeable, all of them aimed at the same frequency. He was ashamed of this and couldn't stop. He was about to find out whether she'd noticed. It was a Friday evening in late May, the kind of warm that makes you understand why people put up porches in the first place. Jason was in his usual spot, the swing creaking slow, a beer sweating in his hand, the street doing its gold then blue routine. The air smelled like cut grass and someone's grill 2 houses down, and the light was thick and amber and made everything look like a photograph you'd want to keep. Emma was on her porch, but tonight she wasn't inside by dark the way she usually was. She was sitting on her front steps in a loose white tank top and cut-off shorts, her legs stretched out and crossed at the ankle, her auburn hair down for once and falling past her shoulders. She was reading something on her phone, tilting the screen away from the glare, and the last of the evening light was sitting on her skin and in her hair in a way that made Jason's chest do something it hadn't done in years. He wasn't staring, he was looking, or that's what he told himself, though the difference was thin and he knew it even as he thought it. He watched the way the evening sat on her, the way she was completely at ease in her own space, the way her hair moved a little when the breeze came through. Something in him ached with a feeling he had filed under, finished a long time ago. A low pull in his chest that he'd mistaken for gone because it had been quiet for so long. She looked up. Their eyes met across the gap between the porches, maybe 12 feet of warm air and nothing else. He should have looked away. Every instinct he had said, look away, go inside, check your phone, pretend the beer needs your full attention, do anything other than what you're doing right now. But he didn't. He froze, caught, and for a long second they just held there, 2 people on opposite porches with the evening between them. She didn't look away either. She didn't stiffen or pull a face or do any of the things he expected a woman to do when she caught a man watching her. Instead, she smiled. It was slow and knowing. The kind of smile that says I saw you and I'm not bothered by it. The kind that starts at the mouth and reaches the eyes a beat later. And then she said it, clear enough to carry across the gap, her voice warm and unhurried and completely at ease. If you like what you see, come closer. The words landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't move. He couldn't tell if his legs would hold him because the signals between his brain and his body had gotten crossed somewhere in the last 3 seconds. Every reasonable thought insisted this was nothing. She was being friendly. She was the kind of person who said bold things because that was who she was, and it didn't mean what his heart was trying to make it mean. But something underneath all the reasonable thoughts, something older and quieter and more honest, urged go. He set his beer down on the porch railing and stood, and he walked across the gap between the porches, the 12 feet that might as well have been 12 miles, his bare feet on the warm boards, and then on the cool grass, and then on her steps. He sat down beside her, on the top step, close enough that his knee was an inch from hers. She shifted to make room without being asked, and she didn't say anything about what had just happened. He didn't acknowledge the crossing, or the words that had caused it. She just handed him her phone, showing him a photo of a painting she'd found online, a field of wild flowers under a heavy sky, and she said she couldn't stop looking at it and didn't know why. And they started talking about the painting, and then about art, and then about the way some images make you feel something you can't explain, and then about everything else, sitting side by side on her porch steps, while the street went dark around them, and neither of them moved to go inside. The 12 feet between the porches might as well have been a different country now, because he was on her side of it, and the air on her steps smelled like her shampoo, and the evening, and something warm and close that he couldn't name and didn't want to, because naming it would have meant admitting how much he'd wanted to be exactly where he was. After that night, the porch became shared space. Not officially, not with any declaration or arrangement. But most evenings now, they ended up on the steps between the 2 houses, the ones that sat in the narrow gap where the properties met, talking until the street went dark and the porch lights were the only things left glowing. Something had opened between them, and it wasn't physical, not yet, not in any way Jason could point to. It was the way she talked to him now, like the wall between neighbor and something else had a crack in it, and she wasn't pretending it didn't. She asked him things nobody had asked him in years, not surface questions, but the kind that make you reach past the answer you keep ready for strangers. She wanted to know what he thought about when the street went dark. She wanted to know if he missed being married. She wanted to know what he was afraid of, and she asked it like she already knew he was afraid of something and just wanted to hear him say it. He told her about Linda one evening, sitting on the shared steps with 2 beers between them. He told her how the marriage had ended, not with a crash, but with a slow leak, 2 people getting quieter together until the quiet swallowed them. He told her about the years that followed, the porch evenings, the routine, the way you can be fine and lonely at the same time, and not see the contradiction because you've stopped looking for one. He had never spoken any of this out loud to anyone. The words surprised him as they came out, like they were stored in a room he'd forgotten he had, and saying them felt less like confession and more like opening a window in a house that had been closed up too long. Emma listened the way he didn't know people could listen. She didn't prepare her next sentence while he was still talking, didn't flinch at the sad parts or rush to fix them, just sat with him in it, fully present, and when he finished, she didn't offer comfort or advice. She said, "I'm glad you're here, Jason." 4 words spoken low, aimed right at him. And he believed her, which was the part that scared him most, because believing someone is glad you're here means admitting you needed someone to be glad about it. She told him her own story a few evenings later. A long relationship that ended 2 years ago, not with a fight, but with the quiet realization that she was living someone else's plan. A man who was good on paper, but made her feel like she was standing still. And the slow discovery that standing still wasn't the same as being at rest. She'd moved to this street because she wanted quiet, wanted to figure out what her own life looked like when she was the one choosing it. She wasn't running from something. She was walking towards something she hadn't named yet, and she said that last part looking out at the dark street with an expression Jason recognized because he'd worn it himself for years. If this story is speaking to you, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss one like it. The age gap between them surfaced naturally, not as a wall, but as a texture in the fabric of their talks. He teased him about a band he loved that had broken up before she was born, and he teased her about a phone app he couldn't figure out that she used like breathing. The gap was real and they both knew it, but it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like 2 people looking at the same view from different windows, each one seeing something the other couldn't and trading what they saw. Jason felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could count. He felt known. Not completely, not the way you're known after decades, but the way you're known when someone is paying close attention and cares what they find. It was terrifying and warm at the same time, like stepping into a house that's been cold for years and feeling the heat reach your skin. That first flush of thaw that both hurts and heals. Weeks passed and the porch evening stretched longer. She started bringing out 2 beers without asking, pulling them from a small cooler she'd set by her steps, handing one to him as he sat down like this was a thing they'd agreed to years ago. He grilled burgers on a Saturday and carried a plate to her steps, and they ate with their elbows on their knees and juice running down their wrists, and they stayed out until the burgers were gone and the stars were out. A rhythm developed between them that looked from the outside like something that already had a name, though neither of them had said it. They had a spot, the shared steps. They had a time, dusk. They had a pattern, 2 beers, and whatever was on their minds. If someone on the street had watched them from a distance, they would have seen 2 people who belonged next to each other, and the thought of that both warmed Jason and made him cautious in equal measure. She started leaving things on his porch railing the way you leave things for someone. You've decided to take care of a container of soup when he mentioned he had a cold. A bag of tomatoes from her garden, still warm from the vine, with a note that said, "These are better than anything in a store. Don't argue." He ate the soup standing at the counter, and he sliced the tomatoes onto white bread with salt and pepper and ate them outside on the porch, because they tasted like something he wanted to be present for. He started leaving things back, a handful of nails, when she mentioned a loose board, a 6-pack of the beer she liked, tucked beside her door without a note, because leaving a note would have meant naming what they were doing, and he wasn't ready for that. Physical closeness crept in the way seasons change, so gradually you couldn't point to the day it started. She leaned against his shoulder. One evening, when the air turned cool, her weight resting there like it had been looking for a place to land. He put his hand on the small of her back when she tripped on a loose step, and she didn't move away from it, just steadied herself and kept talking. Their knees touched on the shared step most nights, and neither of them adjusted. Each point of contact was small enough to deny, and large enough to feel like a statement neither of them was making out loud. Jason's internal world got more complicated with every evening. He wanted more than porch talks and accidental touches. He wanted to reach for her hand, on purpose, hold it because he meant it, not because the step was narrow and their knees happened to be close. He wanted to kiss her, and he thought about it more than he would have admitted to anyone, including himself, standing at his bathroom mirror some nights, and wondering what it would be like to lean across the gap and press his mouth to hers and stop pretending he didn't want to. But every time the impulse rose, the gap rose with it. He was 52, and she was 33, and he had a body that had done 20 more years of living than hers, and no amount of porch magic could close that distance. He swallowed the wanting and kept showing up, because showing up was the thing he could do. The wanting stayed in his chest like a held breath, present and unspoken, growing a little heavier every evening. And if you've ever wanted something you convinced yourself you didn't deserve, then you already know the shape of those evenings, the way you sit beside someone and feel the distance between your hand and theirs, like a physical thing close enough to close and too far to cross. One night she fell asleep on his shoulder during a long talk about nothing in particular, her weight warm and trusting against him, her breathing slow and even. Jason sat perfectly still for 40 minutes because he didn't want to be the reason she woke up and moved away. He listened to the street and her breathing and the creak of his porch swing across the yard, and he memorized the weight of her against him because he wasn't sure it would happen again. When she did wake, she lifted her head and blinked and looked at him, sleepy and unguarded, and she said, "You're a good pillow, Jason." He laughed, and the laugh came out shaky, and she noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but her eyes stayed on him a beat longer than usual, and the look in them was the same one he'd seen the night she told him to come closer. A Saturday evening changed the rhythm. Emma had a friend over, a woman named Claire, whom Jason had seen come and go a few times, always loud, always curious, always carrying a bottle of wine and a lot of opinions. Jason came out to his porch that evening with his usual beer, and Claire spotted him from across the gap and called out, "Is that the porch guy?" in a voice that traveled the way voices do when someone isn't trying to keep them contained. Emma's face did something complicated. She laughed, but it was a different laugh than the one Jason knew, tighter, with something behind it. He couldn't tell if she was embarrassed or just private, and the not knowing bothered him more than the question itself. Claire kept going, leaning forward on Emma's porch with her wine glass, asking how old he was, calling him sir in a way that was playful to Claire but landed differently on Jason, landing in the exact spot where his confidence was thinnest. Emma tried to redirect, touching Claire's arm, changing the subject, but the words were already out and sitting in the air between the porches. Jason smiled and waved and said goodnight and went inside early, before the street went dark, before the beer was finished. He told himself it was because he was tired, because the job he'd done that morning had been heavier than expected, because early nights were fine sometimes. He knew none of those reasons were true. He knew the real reason was that he'd heard his own age out loud in someone else's mouth, and it had sounded wrong next to hers, like a note in a chord that didn't belong. The next few days he pulled back. He moved his coffee to 6:15 again before she was out, and he drank it inside at the kitchen table instead of on the porch. He still sat outside in the evenings, but he sat behind the screen door, where the mesh made him invisible from her steps, where he could see her porch light come on without being seen looking. He wasn't angry at her. Wasn't even angry at Claire. Not really. He was angry at himself for letting the wanting get big enough to be visible, for forgetting that the gap between their lives wasn't something a few porch evenings could close. The days without her had a specific texture he hadn't expected. The porch was the same, the swing creaked the same, the street went gold and blue and black the same way it always did. But the step beside him was empty, and the empty space had a weight to it, like a chair pulled out from a table where someone used to sit. He caught himself turning toward her porch at dusk, the way you turn toward a sound that isn't there anymore, his body reaching for a pattern it had learned, and his mind refusing to let it complete. The evenings stretched longer than they used to, each one feeling like it had an extra hour stuffed into the middle, an hour that used to belong to her voice and her laugh and the way she said his name and now belonged to nothing but the creak of the swing and the sound of Rusty barking at 7:15. Emma noticed the distance. She texted him on the third day a simple message that said, "Hey, you okay?" And he typed back, "Yeah, just busy with work," and hit send before he could think about how thin it sounded. She responded in less than a minute. "You're a bad liar, Jason." He stared at the screen for a long time and didn't reply. And the silence on his end of the phone felt like the silence on his end of the porch, heavy and deliberate and chosen. 3 days stretched to 4, then 5. The porches sat side by side, both lit, both empty of the two people who used to share them. Jason watched her from behind the screen door some evenings, saw her sitting on her steps alone, saw her look toward his porch, and then look away. The absence between them was louder than the presence had been, the way a room is louder after the music stops, because now you can hear everything the music was covering. On a Wednesday evening, 5 days into the silence, Jason was inside behind the screen door when he heard her porch steps creak. He looked out through the mesh and saw Emma sitting on the shared steps, the ones between their two houses, not her porch and not his, but the in-between. She was alone, and she wasn't reading her phone or waiting for someone else. She was just sitting there facing his door, her hands in her lap, patient and unhurried, like she had nowhere else to be, and all the time in the world to be there. She didn't call out. She didn't text. She didn't wave or knock or do anything that would have given him an excuse to stay inside. She just sat, and the sitting was the loudest thing that had happened on that street in years. Louder than the moving truck, louder than Claire's voice, louder than every word they'd exchanged on those steps. Jason watched her for 10 minutes through the screen, his hand resting on the door handle. Every reason to stay inside lined up in his head like cans on a shelf. He was too old, she was too young. This was too good to be real, and he was a fool for letting it get as far as it had. The list was long and reasonable and completely useless against the sight of her sitting in the in-between, waiting for him to come back out. Watch the way she sat, her shoulders loose, her breathing slow, not tense, not anxious, just there. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't looking at his door every 5 seconds to see if he'd come out. She was simply present on that step, trusting that he would see her, and knowing that seeing her would be enough. And that was the thing that undid him, more than the patience, or the quiet, or the courage it took to sit there alone on a Wednesday night, on steps that belonged to neither of them. She trusted him to come back. She had decided he was worth waiting for, and she had settled into that decision the way she settled into everything else, completely and without apology. He opened the screen door. The hinge squeaked and she looked up, and their eyes met the way they had the night she caught him. Looking, except this time he was the one who'd been caught, behind a door he'd closed on himself. He walked across the grass and sat down beside her on the shared step, and she shifted to make room the way she always did, and the feeling of sitting next to her again was so immediate and so right that it made the 5 days of distance feel like a fever that had finally broken. She didn't say, "Where have you been?" or "I was worried," or anything that would have made it a confrontation. She just looked at him with those warm eyes and let the silence between them soften into something that didn't need filling. Then she said, "I fired Claire from porch duty." And Jason laughed, really laughed, the kind that shakes loose something that was stuck, and she laughed too. And the sound of both of them laughing on those steps in the dark was the sound of the gap closing. They talked until midnight that night, later than they ever had the conversation, moving through everything that had been sitting between them for 5 days and for weeks before that. Claire's comment came up, and the age gap, and the pullback, and the fear. Jason voiced the fear out loud for the first time. Said it like handing her something breakable and hoping she wouldn't drop it. He told her he kept measuring the distance between their lives and finding it too wide, that every time he wanted to reach for her something whispered he had no right to. That 52 and 33 wasn't the same as 30 and 31, and the difference mattered whether he wanted it to or not. Emma heard all of it. She let him finish, and then she said the thing he needed to hear and the thing he was most afraid of in the same breath. "I know how old you are, Jason. I've known the whole time. It's not something I'm working around. It's part of why I like being here with you." She told him she wasn't looking for someone to keep up with, because she'd had that, and it had left her tired and restless and unsure of her own shape. She was looking for someone to slow down with. Someone who sat on a porch and saw the evening, instead of rushing through it to get to the next thing. She told him he was the first person she'd met who made quiet feel like enough, and she said it without drama, without framing, just the plain fact of it laid between them on the step. Jason said the thing he'd been holding for weeks. The thing that had lived in his chest like a held breath through every porch evening, and every accidental touch, and every night he'd sat behind the screen door, pretending he didn't want to be beside her. He told her he'd wanted to reach for her hand 100 times, and stopped every time, because he couldn't tell if she wanted him to. And the stopping had been harder than any job he'd ever done with his hands. She took his hand. She did it first, before he could reach, before he could second guess. She laced her fingers through his, and held on, and the feeling was so simple and so large that he couldn't speak for a moment, and she didn't need him to. They sat there, on the shared step, hands joined, the street dark around them, 2 porch lights burning, side by side, the way they had every night since she moved in. Nothing dramatic happened. No grand declaration, no cinematic moment, no swelling score. Just 2 people sitting close on a step they'd shared for weeks, finally on the same side of the silence. He walked her to her door that night, and at the threshold she turned and kissed him, soft and unhurried, her hand still in his. The kind of kiss that isn't a beginning or an ending, but an arrival. The feeling of reaching a place you've been traveling toward, without knowing the name of it. He stood on her porch for a long moment after she went inside, the night air cool on his face, the street quiet. The 2 porch lights still glowing side by side. The air felt different on his skin, like the world had gotten slightly larger while he wasn't paying attention. Like something he'd thought was sealed shut had been open the whole time. 2 porch lights side by side, burning late into the evening, the way they do when someone is finally sitting with the person they were waiting for. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and leave a comment about the moment that got you the most. The quiet on that street isn't the same quiet it used to be.